Simon Longstaff, and we're coming to you from the iconic Sydney Town Hall, which has been the site for some memorable moments in Australian political history. Tonight's debate is that political correctness has failed itself. Or to put it another way, we're asking, has a well-intentioned movement shot itself in the foot? Has it gone mad by closing down debate, by condemning even its most thoughtful critics of being bigoted, homophobic or racist? Or is something else going on? Is it that the forces of conservatism are just pushing back? Are populism and nationalism creating a new form of conservative correctness, which is just as rabid, just as overbearing? We've seen Brexit. We've seen the decidedly un-PC Donald Trump elected as president in the United States. And we've now got Pauline Hanson polling as high as Marine Le Pen in France. And all of this depends on the votes of people who feel left behind. They feel excluded from the benefits of globalisation. They feel ignored in favour of migrants who they now blame for everything. Did the champions of political correctness create this world themselves? Now, to debate this proposition, we have four wonderful speakers. Speaking for the motion that political correctness has failed itself is Chris Kenny, who's Associate Editor and columnist of the conservative paper, The Australian, and also host of Heads Up on Sky News. And he's joined by Jacinta Price, a councillor from the Red Centre of Australia in Alice Springs. And speaking for the negative, Mikey Robins, who's a comedian, a broadcaster and an author, and he's joined by Tasneem Chopra, who's a specialist on diversity and equity. Would you please welcome them all? Now, after you've heard them speak, you'll be invited to have your turn to go to one of the four microphones which are here to ask a question, to make a comment, but we would really ask you to keep it nice and tight, really succinct, and we'll aim to ensure that there's balance as much as we can in this venue. And what I'll be doing before we go to the wind-up is giving you, just before that talk, the results of a pre-debate poll, which tells you what people were thinking before they heard a word of argument. And then you'll be polled again after the debate with the voting cards you've got to see how the results are finally determined. Now, let us move to our guests. Our first speaker, Chris Kenny, is Associate Editor at The Australian, and as I mentioned, he hosts Heads Up, a conservative talk show on Sky News. He's worked for the former Foreign Affairs Minister Alexander Downer and the man who is now our Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. Please welcome Chris Kenny.
Thank you very much, Simon, and everybody else, and to Mikey and Tasman, of course. In this postmodern, politically correct, post-truth, post-Trump age, we're encouraged to forget facts, ideas and arguments and just speculate on identity and motives. So I guess I'm the token white, middle-aged, heterosexual, right-of-centre, cisgendered male here tonight. I am a victim, of course. The question tonight, though, is not whether I am politically correct or whether you support political correctness, but whether political correctness has failed itself. And Jacinta and I contend that the answer is unambiguously in the affirmative. Political correctness exists to shape our thoughts. As George Orwell explained in detail, control language and you control thought. But it is failing. Dissent is rudely breaking through. The agenda of political correctness is that of the left, the green left, the socially progressive left, the virtue signalling left. The politically correct pretend gender away and reduce heterosexuality to just one of a suite of options. They want us all to pretend that we're saving the planet. They'd like to eliminate borders and nationality. And they decry organised religion, well, organised Christian religion. But in all these areas, the more the PC mob imposes its strictures through the universities, through bureaucracies, and importantly through the media political class, the more the mainstream resists. The primacy of sovereignty is being reclaimed by the masses through Brexit, through what we're seeing in European politics, and of course the rise of Donald Trump. Climate gestures are now under attack, and the Paris Agreement seems increasingly likely to be ignored. It's been trumped. Intolerant anti-Muslim parties are on the march in Europe and Australia, and walls and bans, as we know, figured prominently in Trump's ascendancy. Not only is this happening despite a regime of political correctness in liberal democracies, it is largely a backlash against political correctness. I think the big problem this country has is being politically correct, said candidate Trump. He was that blatant. So too is the resurrected renegade Australian politician Pauline Hanson, who runs anti-Muslim, anti-immigration lines. The problem is, Hanson says, we have not had leaders with the foresight or intestinal fortitude to cast aside political correctness. So if political correctness aided the rise of Trump and Hanson, or indeed the success of Brexit or Marine Le Pen, surely it's failed itself. It's provided a springboard for all that it despises. The moral, ideological and political cowardice of the centre-left and the centre-right parties in the face of this politically correct thought police has created an extreme backlash. This happens, in my view, because political correctness has become an absurdity. It's become a perversity. Instead of railing against Indigenous disadvantage and dysfunction, it attacks a cartoonist. Instead of saving rivers, it attacks coal companies. It boycotts a beer to shut down debate on gay marriage, and it calls out Trump on crudity by enlisting Miley Cyrus and Snoop Dogg. Political correctness has divorced the media political class from the mainstream. It's created a chasm between the political posturing and common sense. And it's worse than you think. When a radicalised Muslim cleric pulled a gun, said he had a bomb and took 17 people hostage in a cafe just about a kilometre from here, claiming allegiance to Islamic State, the politically correct started the social media campaign trumpeting care and solidarity not with the hostages, but for Muslims on public transport. The I'll Ride With You hashtag started when a former Greens candidate in Brisbane tweeted about a fabricated incident on a train. This was virtue signalling to combat an anti-Muslim backlash that never happened. The media loved it. One ABC presenter said it was the only bright spot of the siege. Imagine that, a bright spot in a terror attack. Real people held at gunpoint, 2 innocent people were later killed, while the Twitter PC brigade pretended that mainstream Australians and Islamophobia were the real threat. And it was all fake. But then at the inquest, we learned that the police waited, preferring not to launch an operation against the terrorist. Instead, they launched Operation Hammerhead, which put police on the streets to protect Muslims from this imaginary backlash. Senior police said all their words and actions aimed to maintain community harmony and tolerance. This is political correctness gone mad. Police managing community harmony, but not taking out a jihadist terrorist. Politicians often talk in riddles to avoid mention of Islamism. In response to jihadist terrorism around the world, remember Barack Obama held a, quote, summit on countering extremist violence. People see this weakness and they vote for the hardliners because at least they recognise a serious threat. Political correctness fails itself. Now, on climate, Al Gore climbs a ladder, as you remember, to predict sea level rises that are as catastrophic as they are fanciful. And the politically correct give him a Nobel Prize. One of Australia's leading alarmists, Professor Tim Flannery, was made Chief Climate Commissioner in Australia, despite, or perhaps because, he predicted a permanent drought and water supply crisis for Sydney a decade ago. It's hardly stopped raining since. I checked today, the Warragamba Dam is filled to 95%. Flannery said Adelaide, Melbourne and Brisbane all face the same calamitous future. Speaking of water crisis. Thanks for that. A bit of Tim Flannery pointing at me there. Now, Flannery said that Adelaide, Melbourne and Brisbane also face this calamitous future. Now, such predictions saw the South Australian government spend $1.8 billion on a desalination plant that's never been needed and runs at 10% capacity, costing $1 million a day just to keep it in working order. New South Wales built a $2 billion plant, Queensland got one for $2.6 billion, Victoria built a massive $5.7 billion plant. The Queensland and Victorian desalination plants were delayed during construction by floods. More than $12 billion worth of desal plants in this country, none needed, all effectively mothballed, costing hundreds of millions of dollars a year to keep operational. Here is political correctness hurting taxpayers and increasing scepticism about climate policies. The same PC agenda drove the South Australian government to push for a 50% renewable share, forcing coal-fired generators to close. Now they have the nation's most expensive and unreliable power, and last year endured their first ever statewide blackout. That'll reduce CO2 emissions, Earth hour, every hour. On border protection, the politically correct campaigned against tough laws and got their wish in Australia in 2008. This restarted the evil people smuggling trade, saw at least 1,200 people drown and tens of thousands of people go into detention, and left those who couldn't afford a people smuggler stranded in camps, sliding further back in the queue. That is a fail. The politically correct want gay marriage in Australia, but they don't like Australian voters having a say, so they blocked a plebiscite. If not for the PC brigade, gay marriage would be legal in Australia now. That's a fail. And finally, in Afghanistan, 41 brave Australian soldiers have been killed and 260 people injured fighting the women-hating, gay-hating, democracy-hating, modernity-hating extremists. But when we honoured a soldier as Australian of the Year, it was a former army chief who focused on gender equity and said we should stop using the word guys because it's sexist. Guys. How can we say political correctness is not failing us?
Mikey Robins is an Australian comedian who's hosted popular radio shows and whose interviews have included the Dalai Lama. Would you please welcome Mikey Robins?
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could, Clay, start with a very personal plea. My name is Mikey Robins. I'm a middle-aged, middle-class, heterosexual, married white male with a great fondness for red meat and organised sport. Who will speak for me? Who will speak for me? I tell you who will speak for me, or think they will. Virtually every newspaper columnist, commercial radio announcer and talking head who can be bothered putting on their own makeup and waving their fingers in front of a cable news camera. That's who thinks they speak for me. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's also cartoonists, bloggers and an army of anonymous eggs on Twitter who believe they are defending the rights of men, and in some cases women, with the same socio-economic place in society that I have. They are the mainstream. They think they speak for me, but they don't. Which brings me to my first point. If, as the affirmative suggests, political correctness has failed, then why do the media elites keep banging on about it? A supposed threat to our society, and that they are the only few brave voices in the wilderness that stand between us and some supposed Orwellian-styled PC nightmarish future. If political correctness is such a failure, why the column inches, the endless radio rants and finger waves down television cameras, saving us from this supposed failed ideology? Look, when I was at university, I hated the Trotskyists Couldn't stand any of that Trotskyist blah, blah, blah. And let's face it, the Internationale is an awful song. But to be honest, that's the first time I've mentioned Trotskyism in over 25 years. And why? It failed. Pure and simple. The chances of a Trotskyist-inspired revolution are about the same as me taking to the field and playing right flanker for the Wallabies. Ain't gonna happen. Although both might give me a heart attack. So if we had to use one of the measures of the success of political correctness, say it's our so-called opponents' constant war against it, their constant need to decry it and supposedly protect us from its insidious intents. Well, all I can say is well done, political correctness. You must be doing something incredibly effective to get so many well-educated people, so many intelligent people who could be doing so many other wonderful productive things to commit so much time and effort, whipping themselves up into a frenzy to decry your so-called failed existence. Political correctness is still part of our agenda. Oh, and while I'm at it, being politically correct was actually a gently applied self-mocking phrase originated by those on the left, used for decades to rib each other when they thought that attempts to recodify language in the rapidly changing years of the 20th century may have gone a bit too far. It was used by the people who invented these new, less rigid terms to actually have a bit of a dig at themselves. And let's be honest, there have been moments of verbal excess. We have in the past few decades have found ourselves in a world very different to the world our ancestors lived in. And just as our ancestors did, we have modified our language to respond to the times in which we live. It's that simple. Political correctness is just a way of sorting out language, terms, in a constantly changing world. But that's not where you hear the phrase politically correct from those who would like to attack it. I know these days it's shouted shrilly when someone's responding to criticism of their work or perceived criticism of their values. You can't say that, you're just being politically correct. Or I'm here to stand against the damage that political correctness is doing to our great nation. It's an easy out, most voiced from those on the right, and just as lazy and content void argument as when some equally vapid voice on the left lets loose with, "You're worse than Hitler." Rule 1, you use that phrase, you've already lost the debate. Once again, if you ever have to hide behind "you're just being politically correct," rather than engage with why you may have offended someone, you've lost the argument. Thank you. Oh, and while I'm dipping my toes into historical waters, every time someone gets upset with someone being politically correct, we hear the phrase politically correct McCarthyist witch hunts. Now, unless my high school history was way off, McCarthyism was invented by powerful, wealthy right-wing men, the same sort of men that several centuries years ago, before, thought that witch hunting seemed to be a good way to spend the weekend. You know what, those on the right, if you're going to keep complaining about political correctness, why don't you come up with a few of your own catchphrases every now and then? Which brings me to freedom of speech and causing offence. It all depends on the nature of that offence. And to prove that, I'm about to use some free speech to say something that a lot of people, I'm afraid to admit, might find deeply offensive. I am a neighbour of Chris Kenny's. I've appeared on talking head TV shows with Chris Kenny, but probably not after this. I've shared cabs and drinks with Chris Kenny, and quite frankly, Chris Kenny's a really nice guy. There, I've said it. May the universe forgive my soul.
It's very politically incorrect.
But to be serious, we do have a right, I believe this, we do have a right to cause offence, and conversely, if offended, respond to that offence. It's how you choose to offend that matters. Do you choose to make fun of a person because of their actions, or by just the plain simple fact of who they are? I've caused offence in the past, and will cause offence in the future. Quite frankly, it's part of my job, and it's fun. And I probably don't always get it right. And I've been made fun of myself. Many, many times over. It comes with the territory. Not everything that one says is going to be universally popular. And these days there are so many ways to feel that sting of that unpopularity. Megan Morris, in her fabulous essay, Sticks and Stones and Stereotypes, which should be a great name for a Rolling Stones best of album, had this telling sentence: if promoters of unpopular ideas do suffer for their faith, they can tell the world about it. New media are giving the most eccentric people ways to find partners in dissent. Amazingly, that was written almost 20 years ago. And we all know by now, and Chris rightly pointed this out, the barbs that can be delivered by social media. But I will say this for the Twitter brigade and the trolls: they are to be found on both sides of the PC debate. No one can claim the higher ground. Basically, any lonely nutter out there with a smartphone can jump on board. So has political correctness failed? No, I see it as just a way of fairly dealing with a changing and complex society. And sure, it has missed a step occasionally. And yes, it has suffered a few self-inflicted wounds. But it sure beats a bizarre desire to return to some mythical past which never really existed and leaves its devotees filled with fist-waving and mocking slurs. Or as Elvis Costello so wonderfully put it many, many years ago, what's so funny about peace, love and understanding? Thank you.
Jacinta Price is an Alice Springs councillor working to address domestic violence and other challenging social issues in her Central Australian community. She's also an award-winning singer. Please welcome her.
Good evening, everyone. Political correctness has failed itself because it does more harm than good for my people. Policing the language for offensive ideas does nothing to address the real problems my people face. In fact, it's making it worse. Political correctness is allowing self-identified victims to take offence because their delicate feelings are hurt. Meanwhile, the pack cry of racism is being used to silence the real victims and obscure the truth and create excuses about the real problems confronting my people. My name is Jacinta Price. I'm a Warlpiri Celtic woman, and I've been called an Aboriginal, an Aborigine, or Indigenous person, but the latest fad tells us that First Nations person is the politically correct term. But how clinical and impersonal does that sound? But it won't be long until it becomes politically incorrect. At least, I hope so. My Warlpiri side traces back in a straight line over 50,000 years. My other side is mixed up Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and don't tell my Scottish husband, English as well. And who knows what else. But I just call myself a black fella. In Warlpiri, I am a yapakaji, an Aboriginalised word from the English term half-caste. Yapakaji sounds better than half-caste though, but it basically means the same thing. It's not offensive, merely descriptive, and I'm happy to use it. Funny. You know, my mob keep being told by others, usually outsiders who don't know us, what we're supposed to call ourselves. I believe we're supposed to do this to make sure that the outsiders feel more comfortable about who they are. I come from the final frontier. Newly minted rituals of political correctness reach us last. We uncivilised territory folk are lectured in politically correct speak and best practice to engage Aboriginal people by fly-in, fly-out city dwellers in their leather vests and hipster hairstyles or via long email directives from Canberra. As my husband's people, the Scots, as well as white Australians, who are my mates by the way, in Warlpiri tradition, we can be outspoken, unsubtle, and even use profanity to express affection. Fancy that. For example, since she was a baby, my darling niece, who I love dearly, has been known as Mulyawiri, which means big nose, because she has a big nose. She doesn't have an issue with this. Nor did the late internationally renowned artist Jangala Robertson have a problem with his nickname Pakanjali. Let me give you a quick lesson in Warlpiri linguistics. There are no F or S sounds in Warlpiri, so P is substituted for F and J for S. Pakanjali got his nickname because he would become frustrated with the youth in his family who would never listen to advice. So he would repeatedly tell them that they were all Pakanjali. This cultural means of communication and affectionate name-calling remains a strong practice to this day. We relish not taking ourselves too seriously because we have more serious fish to fry. But humour seems a dying art these days. Am I right, Mikey?
God, I hope not.
I hope not. As one of my favourite comedians, John Cleese, said recently, the idea that you have to be protected from any kind of uncomfortable emotion is one I absolutely do not subscribe to. But these days, you can't relax and be spontaneous because, well, you don't know what might upset people. Paradoxically, members of the identified minorities see themselves as incapable of racism, but as having a right to bully others. My mother and I have received death threats and are routinely vilified by some Indigenous people in racist, misogynistic and obscene terms for daring to voice opinions that differ from their own. The biggest problem with political correctness is that, like racism, it denies the truth and deals in stereotypes. For Aboriginal people, this means they're actively discouraged from critically analysing their own thinking and actions and how they contribute to their own problems. It treats adults like irresponsible children. Political correctness actively seeks racism where it doesn't exist. Bill Leake's famous cartoon is a perfect example. I know decent, devoted Aboriginal fathers who didn't feel they were stereotyped by it because they knew exactly that it wasn't aimed at them, and because they all know fathers like the one Leake drew. They know, as I do, that there's truth in it, and it's a problem that needs to be addressed. People claim that the Aboriginal father depicted Aboriginal men as deadbeat dads, but the policeman is also Aboriginal. Does the cartoon also stereotype Aboriginal men as policemen? There are some hard truths at play that people are reluctant to face. Better to shut down the truth teller, and the violence, dysfunction, sexual abuse and real pain still go on. But if you talk about it, well, you're racist. So while we've got witch hunts for racists and racism, labelling and name-calling are the weapons used to shut down the truth. Silence is the objective. No questioning, no constructive criticism, no debate, no critical thinking, no challenge and no growth through progress. The real victims are the silent majority who you don't get to hear over the racket of the offenderati. Women in remote Aboriginal communities are threatened with execution, torture and rape for committing offences against traditional law. Everybody who lives and works in these communities knows this to be true, but nobody talks about it. Black lives matter. Yes, they do. But not just the black lives that are taken by white people. The American Black Lives Matter movement is politically correct. It highlights only the black deaths at the hands of white perpetrators. The Ku Klux Klan lynched 3,446 black Americans over 86 years, an average of 40 per year. But now 2,380 black Americans are murdered by other black Americans every year. Australians march in the streets condemning black deaths in custody, yet no one is marching about the crisis levels of Aboriginal people dying at the hands of Aboriginal people. So why are the activists perpetuating this political correctness? And why are our politicians buying into it? Political correctness is hiding the truth, not to save lives, but to save hurt feelings from the truth. The truth is that Aboriginal women are 34 times more likely to be hospitalised by family violence, and in remote communities, this figure triples. The truth is that over 60% of Aboriginal male incarceration is due to acts of violence against family members. Solving these problems needs open discussion. The political correctness shuts down debate. Political correctness and racism are two sides of the same coin, and they feed off each other. I'd rather know who the racists are. Let them express their opinions so I can call them out and defeat them with facts and intelligent arguments. I am not afraid of them.
And finally, we come to our fourth speaker, Tasneem Chopra. She's a cultural commentator on women's issues, race, psychology and politics. She also heads the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. Please welcome Tasneem Chopra.
That's better. So, this isn't business, this is personal. Political correctness has assuredly come to the defence of me and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people like me who refuse to be silenced, placated or told to stay in our lane because our diversity goes beyond the spectrum of what the dominant class perceives as acceptable. Ever get the feeling that being PC is a virtual seal on the pressure cooker that is unbridled racism, misogyny, homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism and hatred of puppies, all put together? How does PC impact me? Well, let me count the ways. Let me speak to a range of experiences where, without PC being in check, I've been exposed to some rather daunting remarks, ranging from the mildly awkward, where I've been welcomed to Australia, though I've been here since I was 4, to being commended on my impressive grasp and command of English, to which I've responded, yours is pretty good too, to having my turban touched by complete strangers and told it's so colourful and exotic. Right down to, why don't you go back to where you came from, which was Bendigo. And with all due respect, no thank you. I'm a city girl. And of course, to finally being told, you know, you're not like the others, you're one of the good Muslims. I don't have a problem with you. How kind. In every case, from the innocuous to the inappropriate, this commentary has been underscored with entitlement. Who gets to speak for me? I know Mikey gets to speak for Mikey. But who decides what I should look, sound and behave like? Believe? Who decides all that? Apparently, if I remind others that my choices and my voice are my own, in a bid to reclaim my dignity, they get a bit touchy. Surely a bigot's right cannot outweigh my right to human dignity. Freedom of speech does not include freedom from responsibility. Well, for grown-ups anyway. Apparently, privilege is a precious mantle. When not handled with kid gloves, it seems, can result in the custodians of that privilege losing their collective shingles. And so it's necessary that PC, being PC, thrives so that we don't feed the pigeons, the bigots. At this point, I would ask of Chris and his colleagues and counterparts, who challenge the right to offend as an entitlement, and indulge them with, in your vast experience as a middle-class, white, Anglo-Saxon person of privilege, please tell me about your experiences of racism. No, really, please tell me how, as a woman and a woman of colour, you have negotiated threats to your person or been asked to go back to where you came from, and how have you endured racist discourses locating you as the other, irrespective of your contributions? Who gets to choose the headlines, the contents, the images that go with those stories? The many stereotypes, how many can you squeeze into a tabloid word count? In a PC-free context, the image of a bearded man of maybe Middle Eastern appearance would likely be appended with scary suspected Islamist terrorist, whereas you'd be hard-pressed to ever read the context of a similar image with a caption of elderly, middle-white, Christian and alcoholic, wife-beating ex-criminal. Just don't see those titles, do you? Certainly being politically correct won't deliver the sensationalism required to raise revenue and the terror threat level, but as Cheryl Kernot famously quipped once, it will keep the bastards honest. Being PC highlights the glaring biases here for what they are. Divisive reporting, the lack of balance and nuance matters. We keep seeing panel after panel of experts discussing refugees and same-sex marriage and the Australian Muslim conundrum, so often without representatives from those communities present on the panels. When a morning TV show host, whose skill set includes ballroom dancing and endorsing vitamins, is given the platform to decide whether or not there should be a Muslim ban in this country, the outrage from the PC police, which was due, was more to not just the sheer insanity of her flawed logic and her as a mother defence, but rather the privilege that she's afforded to speak on primetime slots lacking any qualification or counter commentary. Now that's offensive. Without the PC machine to call out xenophobic, transphobic, homophobic, Islamophobic, misogynist tendencies, we end up backwards and not forwards. Being PC is often our only weapon at our disposal. In this war against stereotypes, it's often all we've got left. Dominant voices run the show. They write history, draft policies, set agendas, often at the expense of minority groups without a platform of their own. And when you dare challenge these dominant groups for their less than balanced accounts, they claim the PC police are out to get them. Yes, them with their finger on the pulse of systems and centuries of oppression and privilege and economic gain. That's a little precious, I think. Being PC gives licence to call out all that is foul. Without it, casual misogyny and casual homophobia and casual racism sneak their way into our day-to-day conversations, which become the standards we accept and the legislation we inherit. PC, it's all we have. Without it, we have Trump. Yes, Trump. Alpha male leader who sets a regressive agenda, he calls it reform, marked by sexualising his own daughter, advocating for the non-consensual grabbing of women's bodies, the banning of people from an entire faith to his country, offending the disabled, the Mexicans, the reporters, prisoners of war, African Americans and Asians, and that's before he got elected. And in this country, we've not been spared the bastion of white privilege that seeks to manipulate systems and communities into an us and them dichotomy. We've endured debacles ourselves with a previous Prime Minister who appointed himself Minister of Women because he had 3 daughters. And of course, Minister of Indigenous Affairs, just because. Indeed, the rise of right-wing conservatism gaining traction in the States and across Europe has meant that speaking for respect and inclusion in taking a politically correct stance is almost like sedition. Let me be clear. This rise has not occurred because of political correctness, but rather in spite of it. Historically, there has been traction in getting votes in this country by escalating fear of difference. And it has only been political correctness that has called out duplicity of sloganism like children overboard or stop the boats. This country's bloodied history too is mired in a background of genocide and dispossession. Political correctness becomes a siren now to warn against social control and call out injustices. There's a middle ground to be found between the spectrum of hate and love, and it's not about silencing conversation, but ensuring there's respectful discourse. In a word out to the garden variety politically challenged bigot, though, I would say that if in the name of free speech and patriotism you are abusing, insulting, offending, harassing, spitting on, attacking, maligning, punching, bashing, threatening to rape or murder someone because they look, sound or believe different to you, Your politics are incorrect. It is not my responsibility to assist a bigot unpack and break down their racism about me. That's not how this works. Bigotry needs to be called out, privilege needs to be held to account, and pundits need to step aside from platforms where they dissect, debate, and negotiate the very people they exclude from speaking. So, step aside. I don't need saving. I just need the damn mic. Thank you.
Well, it's a long way down. Thanks so much to all our speakers. In a moment I'm going to open the floor to you. It's a feature of these debates, which go back to the Cambridge and Oxford Union, that you get a chance also to ask a question or speak. Short, succinct, but punchy. That's what we're looking for. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is to tell you the results of the pre-debate poll. Thanks, Chris. So you're all asked, I hope, on your way in as to what you thought about this question. And the question before us is that political correctness has failed itself. And the pre-debate poll stood as such. So there were 31% undecided. So a really genuine question for you two to argue for as to who's going to win here. For the motion was 47%. And against it only 22%. Now, we have seen really big swings before, but what is now going to be said in this auditorium is probably going to determine the result, as well as the arguments so far. So I'm going to open it up. There are 4 microphones. You can see them down here. If you're upstairs and you want to come and join the conversation, please come to either microphone 1, 2, 3 or 4. Please come out now if you'd like to, and you can pose a question or you can make a very brief comment, but the aim is to try and get it balanced and engaged.
I think political correctness is being overlooked here. How many people in this audience would like to be called a kaffir, or a faggot, or a wog, or a spick, or a chickadee, or a dolly bird? Those are the sorts of words that political correctness has done away with, and I think it's very important that we continue to do that.
We're going down to 4 next.
I just want to say, we'll go ahead. And those are the words that are at the base of bullying. If we want to talk bullying, that's bullying. That language is bullying.
Microphone 2.
I was one of the people who said, who was in the middle, I don't have an opinion. It's not because I'm illiterate or don't have a stand on this, but I didn't know what you meant by political correctness. And I still don't know what you mean by political correctness.
Okay.
Hello, my name's Anthony. I guess my question's open to all of you as well. In my personal experience, I've found that to some degree political correctness seems to be killing discussion. I've had a lot of discussions with people about same-sex marriage, which I'm much in favour of. But when I've defended people's right on the other side to actually have that argument, to be against it and actually bring their points forward, I've been vilified, had threats against me and abuse. So my question is this killing the discussion?
Okay, thank you. Look, thank you. It comes, Mikey and Tasneem, to the question about bullying. I think when people are talking about political correctness in this context, they're talking about no platforming, about shouting down people who they don't agree with, rather than having the conversation. It's that sense that there are some things that must not be said or discussed in any context, including even a discussion like this.
I think there is a danger of controlling the conversation by if we start putting parameters on where you can go and where you can't go in a conversation, that can stifle the debate. I understand that and I accept that. By the same token, I think when we're talking about defining and understanding particular communities, they should have the agency to define and explain how they want to be perceived. It should not be coming from an outside party to do that, and that's frequently what we are seeing. We're having the broader mainstream, or even sometimes the broader left, co-opt what they believe should be the way we identify, whether it's same-sex couples or whether it's Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, Muslims, Islamist Australians. Everyone has a name and a label, but you need to allow those communities to have agency about their description. I think that would help define, or would certainly start the conversation on the right topic. In terms of defining what is PC, to me it's about the ability to have safe and respectful conversation that is inclusive of a variety of peoples and instances and occasions without causing harm. And there has to be a line where free speech doesn't cause offence to harm and injure. And I think once that gets transgressed, I mean, we're going to make Australia hate again, forget great again.
And Jacinta, do you think of political correctness in the same terms then, as the boundaries for respectful conversation? Or do you have in mind the picture I painted of it, of the thing that closes down the possibility of conversation? I want to know what it is that you think is failing.
I think what Tasneem is describing there is just manners, good old-fashioned manners, which, you know, I think most of us Australians have for one another. Sure, we don't understand everything about one another, but I believe we have manners. And in this country in particular, I think we should be proud of the fact that we have the world's oldest living culture, and we have modern Western and Australian culture, and we're not trying to kill each other. Whereas countries overseas where there's, you know, no difference ethnically with slight religious differences, and they are trying to kill each other. I think we're doing a pretty damn good job here in Australia, and I for one can say from the Northern Territory, well, maybe you guys should all come and see how we live, because we get on with one another. You know, we have babies with one another. We've got so many different backgrounds, and this idea of, you know, we look at what we have that's similar to one another. We are, after all, first and foremost, human beings. And you know, to put this framework around us, I think, you know, that allows us to sort of trip up. Oh, hang on, no, you're saying the wrong thing. Oh, whoops, okay, I better pull myself in there. I think sometimes, you know, we've got to build up strong individuals by understanding who we are as individuals and what we have to offer this world. If someone's words is going to hurt your feelings, then you need to work on that as an individual, I think.
Okay, let's get back to the floor. We're going to microphone number 2.
I guess my question is to both sides. I came to Australia 13 years ago from Zambia. I'm Australian now, work as a physician, found myself in a place where I feel like I can have some vote or say. And like you said, I think the arguments we do have sometimes are in debates, you telling other people, but you're not part of the experience. I guess you're not from there. So people tell me, oh, Xavier, you look nice. I used to have an afro. They all grab, you know, touch your afro, like, oh, so nice. You black guys can dance. You know, I mean, all true, but I think where do we go from here? You know, I don't know, like for someone like myself, you're big personalities, you're people out there, people like us, ordinary people, I think a lot of us here are ordinary. Where do we go from here to push it forward? So both parties, where can I go and try and, I'm definitely think political correctness works, it has its kinks, but where to from here for that?
Another one of the audience members mentioned that political correctness has done away with certain slurs we think are terrible, and Tasneem, you said that it has stopped people putting a caption on an image of a bearded man saying that he's a terrorist, but isn't the real issue whether it's actually reducing the extent to which people think these things and have these racist, bigoted views, you know, regardless of whether they're saying them out loud. And I'm just curious to know your thoughts on, you know, doesn't Trump's election show that, in fact, to a great degree, it's helped to unify and strengthen the bigots and sort of that base?
Yeah. And that's the essence of the question, isn't it, Mikey?
Yes.
Has it gone too far, which has been a theme here, and has it actually catalysed a backlash which has given the Trumps and the Brexits and all the rest?
I'm the first to admit, I think we can all find some middle ground. Yes, there are times, and as I said, political correctness is a term the left came up to mock itself. There are times when you go, oh, come on, for heaven's sake. But surely, in the decades when we've actually have been using political correctness to find the words to describe the world we live in and the world we want to live in, surely it has done more good than it's done harm.
Okay. Well, Chris, person down at number one, I think, put a really powerful challenge to your side, saying, look, if you don't have the political correctness narrative there reining people in, then the bigots and the genuine racists are actually shutting down debate just as much as what you would think the political correctness mob are doing.
Yeah, I think that's central to this whole debate, and it's kind of offensive when people suggest because you're against political correctness that you somehow are in favour of coarseness or racism or whatever in the debate. It's nothing that either I or Jacinta, I'm certain, would argue. Political correctness is about the zeitgeist restricting free speech. It's about the progressive green left controlling the debate and putting strictures on debate so that people can't go outside what they see as the zeitgeist, what they see as being politically correct. It's informal and it can be institutionalised. And essentially the difference between our side and the against side is that we are optimistic about Australians and our multicultural project. We believe that Australians are tolerant, peace-loving, inclusive people, and we believe that the evidence to that is incontrovertible, that this nation is perhaps one of the greatest example, if not the greatest example, of an immigrant culture grappling with these issues and doing it in a peaceful and tolerant way. And we think that mainstream Australians are the best check against intolerant, crude, racist language. We think that other Australians are the ones who stick up for people when they're bullied and make sure that we all treat each other with respect. We don't need the ABC or Sydney University or SBS or the Human Rights Commission to tell us what we think. Whereas what Tasneem and Mikey put to us is a very bleak picture of Australians who are seething with racism and intolerance, and it's only the strictures of political correctness that's keeping us all at bay. And then this is not right. Chris, just let me finish.
Yeah, just finish now, because I've got to give them a chance to respond.
Just let me finish.
No, hang on, Mikey. Wait. No, let him finish, and then I will come to you.
I have one sentence. I have one sentence.
So we can have it.
So to me, it's an optimistic view of mainstream Australians versus a very bleak view, and I have faith in the Australian people. And the third point then is why do people... Now the final point is what motivates people to go down this political correctness path, and I think I'm firmly convinced the great motivation is virtue signalling. Okay. How do I demonstrate to everybody that I am not a racist unless I decry somebody else as a racist? That's what we're saying.
Now you have one line.
I have one line.
I want to go to Tasneem. One line.
I have one line, and I couldn't agree with Chris more in one respect. Yes, I do believe in the great goodness of what, for want of a better term, we call mainstream Australia. Because I believe that mainstream Australia, on the whole, is politically correct.
Tasneem?
In a recent poll by SBS and Western Sydney University, where 6,000 respondents were interviewed, 80% acknowledged we have a racism problem. Now, in acknowledging that we have a problem, that is a silver lining, because then we know there are steps to do something. Now, PC is an antidote to bigotry because it sets boundaries beyond which offence cannot be made, and if it does, we call it out. That's what it's there for. It's to stop it in its tracks.
Okay, but do you think that there are some topics that should not be discussed at all? For example, that certain people should be denied an opportunity to speak on a stage like this because of what they believe or what they say? No, I want to ask Tasneem whether she thinks that.
There has to be agency and there has to be legitimacy. I think if you're going to have a debate about Muslims in Australia, there should be Muslims on a panel. I'm just putting that out there. I don't think it's really radical. I think it's logical, but we've seen that that doesn't happen. And then you end up having self-appointed experts outside that realm giving critical information. And you know what? It comes down to platforms. And I mentioned this before. When people with particularly bigoted, one-sided right-wing views occupy 90% of the platform in media or headlines or spaces that represent and discuss a community that actually occupies 3% of the population, we're asking for a very problematic outcome.
But what about people like Jacinta? I mean, she was saying that she cannot raise certain points of view, and I take it it's not just other Indigenous people who would attack you, but there's a broad cross-section. What's your answer to her when she says, I want to say things which are unpopular and unconventional, perhaps, within that view? Should she be able to say
Absolutely.
them? Yes.
Absolutely, yes, because she's speaking from an authentic viewpoint, and I think she has more traction and credibility and kudos to say that than Chris would.
Jacinta?
What if they're not politically correct views? Look, I'll tell you what political correctness has done. My mother, who's a former Minister of the Northern Territory, when she was an MLA, was to speak at Griffith University, the Indigenous unit. The Indigenous unit turned down her visit, basically because some of her views would, well, for the safety and well-being, she was told, of some of the students at the Indigenous unit, because this full-blood Warlpiri woman, grandmother and elder, held some views that might somehow harm, I don't know how, but harm these students. This was political correctness at play. Now, the thing that I'd like to ask is, if she wasn't an Aboriginal woman from the bush, female, if she was one of these revered male Indigenous leaders of our country, would the same thing have happened? Would they have so easily turned them down? She was once on Insight, and she'd said to a panel member on Insight, a young Indigenous descendant, she didn't realise by looking at her that she was Aboriginal. Now, as I've mentioned, people from the bush, they just say what's on the top of their heads, and this is how my mother was brought up. She said, sorry, I didn't realise you were a black fella just by looking at you. That's what she said. She was not being politically correct, and this is what was then used against her to stop her from visiting a university, for crying out loud. Universities, I thought, were places for people to be challenged. It seems these days we're supposed to mollycoddle our young people and have them only think one particular view, and that is the politically correct view, and not think outside the box.
And before we hear the results, I just think, for coming up and having this debate, whatever the outcome, could you thank our speakers, Chris Kenny, Jacinta Price, Mikey Robins and Tasneem Chopra. Well, now to the results. So beforehand, if I can find the paper, undecided was 31%, or 22% against, and 47% were for. Now, undecided has dropped to 13%. The for vote has dropped to 18%. And the against vote is 69%, which I declare quite amazing. Congratulations to the winners. Well done, everyone. Everybody took place.